All right, this next phase is called the Taisho democracy. Um, we're going to be looking at what internally democracy looks like under the Taisho era. So we had just got done looking at the outside in terms of how things are working internationally for foreign policy with Japan, right? How is their ambitions for expansion looking at? Now, again, we're kind of going back into Japan and looking at the internal side of things, right? Domestically. So early political instability, as stated before, from 1918 to 1932, Japan was going through the period known as Taisho democracy. Their leader, Takashi, formed the country's first government party. This party had the support mostly of rural areas. So rural means like outside of the cities, right? Farmlands, suburbs, kind of, not so much suburbs, but just like very remote areas. Its goal was to mostly improve Japan's economic situation and standard of living. He was the party. This party was the majority party in the Diet until 1914. Uh, Lost a majority and gained it back in 1918. Takashi was the first prime minister of Japan because his party held the majority in the House of Representatives. In 1921, he was assassinated. People believe that he was targeted because he became corrupt and suppressed left wing politics, but his assassin claimed that he just wanted to be famous, right? Basically, and to bring revolutionary change into Japan. 23, an earthquake hits Tokyo. About 100,000 people die. During this earthquake, large fires break out. 700 homes were burned down. Very sad, very tragic moment in history at this, you know, for this event, right? Rumors broke out though um, that the Korean population was responsible for this. I don't know why Koreans would cause an earthquake and cause a fire, but basically there was a lot of people who were like, yeah, this totally makes sense, right? And so we start to see hate crimes against them begin. In 1613, people, sorry, 1,613. I don't know why I read that as a date. 1,613 people die in these riots. All in this chaos of fear and hysteria, labor leaders were also arrested and executed as they were seen as members of the left wing, right? Um, One thing I'll say is that when you start to see a lot of instability within a country, whether it's economic, political, or whatever, you do start to see a lot of hate crimes rising. So unfortunately, the Koreans, and remember, they like, had just colonized Korea, right? The Koreans are the ones who are going to suffer the most in Japan. Well, not the most, but one of the most, right? Um, and they're being blamed for a lot of things, and they're going to be blamed for more later on. Um, all of this ended up leading to the country adopting more right-wing ideologies and demanding for greater security. So it's like, all of this instability, all these assassinations, the fire, the Koreans, all these things, right? We got to get tougher. We got to almost like the equivalent of what you would hear, like we got to build the border wall, right? This is what like they're trying to do, not necessarily because they're an island, that's not going to happen, but just greater security, right? Despite this, the appointment of the leader of the majority party as prime minister had been established and was practiced until 1932. The Constitutional Government Party called for universal voting rights and civil rights. When they came into power in 24, they granted men over the age of 25 the right to vote. It also passed the peace preservation law, but this law was intended to curb quote unquote dangerous thought. Basically anything that went against these right-wing ideologies, right? So if you were in the socialist, communist, anarchist, or just even a little bit left-leaning or just not super right-wing, you were seen as suspicious, and if you made it super obvious that you weren't down for these things, they would go after you, right? In 1927, the new law, a new part liberal party, sorry, that's supposed to say party, a new party, liberal party, was formed to support liberal policies. This party depended on urban population rather than rural. It worked closely with business interests and wanted a more pleasing foreign policy. It also enforced the London Naval Treaty, mentioned before. Um, I don't want you to think as the Liberal Party as the left-wing party in Japan, because it's still supporting like capitalism, and like it has a lot of right-wing ideologies implemented into this party. The only difference is that they kind of want to like, kind of loosen up a little bit and like create policies that are more business friendly. Okay. Although you did begin to see political parties in Japan multiply, you never see any of them really establish dominant power. Like if you're from the United States, you'll know that the United States has two dominant parties, the Republican Party and the Democrat Party, and like they kind of switch back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, right? Um, those are the ones that are dominating. In Japan, it's just like all these parties, and really nobody has an idea of who's going to end up winning because there's just so many and everybody has their opinion and everybody's stubborn, right? This prevented political parties from being able to have a strong presence in Japanese society. Aside from that, political parties were weakened because they had no strong popular support. One, two, they were corrupt. Three, there was an intense rivalry. And four, there was a lack of cooperation. All of this made it that all these parties were very suspicious of each other. And like, I don't really trust that party, so let's not collaborate. Or like, once they did collaborate, they would backstab each other and kind of like um, basically say that they were going to do one thing and then do another thing, right? So there was no real clear political ideology for the country, while there is a rise in right-wing ideology though, but like in terms of how this right-wing ideology is going to be driven through Japan is not very clear, right? The lack of unity within the government's policies led to the country's economic conditions to worsen. So if you have a government that can't decide on how things are going to happen, when there's tragedy, when there's things that need to get done, nobody really knows, like can't really decide on what decisions to make. Tragedies and economic crisis and political crisis, they don't pause just because you can't make a decision, right? So these things aren't pausing in Japan. Like the economic conditions are not taking, they're not pausing. So while like these parties are trying to decide, hey, what should we do, right? The country's democracy was beginning to fall, and it found itself falling bit by bit into right-wing ultranationalism. So it's like extreme, 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 right? At this point in time, Emperor Showa replaces Emperor Taisho. We're going to look into who Emperor Showa is and why he ends up replacing him. Um, when we look at political developments for the left-wing parties, what's happening, like I said, they're being suppressed. Hush hush, right? Like I said, the Liberal Party, don't view the Liberal Party that was created in Japan around this time as the left-wing party. They're not. They're still right wing. They still support capitalism, and all their policies are to cater towards capitalism, which is not a left wing ideology. So Japan's slow shift into ultranationalism is still leading to the suppression of any left wing movements, thoughts, ideologies, all these things, right? The expansion of who could vote in 1925 made recruiting people to join leftist parties a lot easier, but the establishment of the peace preservation laws, which I had mentioned earlier, limited the freedom of speech and held back many from being able to vote because they were a part of leftist movements. So, you had all these barriers already, and being able to vote over the age of 25, that doesn't like that's not a lot of people, and it's men, right? So it's there's a lot of these barriers that leftists have in order to kind of get any momentum in Japan. Japan had a lengthy history of attempting to shut down these leftists. In 1906, a socialist party was established by and was banned in 1907. In 1920, the Japanese Communist Party was secretary was established in 1922, but shut down in 24 when the leaders were arrested, and remained banned until after World War II. In 1920, the Socialist League was formed, but it was weakened when it was split into two in 1932. In 1928, the Japanese general election did not see an increase in left-wing parties gaining seats, despite the fact that there were more people who were allowed to vote. Why? Because again, rich businesses and rich citizens, known as the Sabatsu, financially backed traditional Japanese parties that would support their financial interests. This includes any right-wing parties and the Liberal Party, which is also, I would say, right-wing. This led to an eventual ban in trade unions in 1940. So as you can see, all of this is being done intentionally so to ensure that Japan goes in the way that supports imperialism, supports capitalism, supports the rich and the businesses, right? And that's why left-wing parties are being shut down. Social and cultural changes in the 1920s. During the 1920s, Japan was influenced by Japan's culture and customs. A rivalry between rural Japanese urban people sorry, a rivalry between rural Japanese people, urban Japanese, was created. This created a mentality of those who lived in rural areas were ignorant people who were living in poverty because of their old ways, and they were stuck in the past and they had no desire for progress, right? those who lived in rural areas saw urban life, city life, as a corrupt one that went against Japanese culture and traditions. This led the mentality. This mentality led people helped the ultranationalists find strong support in rural areas. Right? Sorry, the wording of that is really weird. Especially since those who lived in rural areas rejected Western culture and were more on the conservative side. You didn't really need to convince these people to be conservative, to be super nationalistic, right? Because they kind of already were. Economic changes, industry and agriculture in the 1920s, World War One had offered Japan great opportunity to grow and develop the country's arms and export industries. The consumption of Japanese goods grew in nearby Asia countries, but also in European and in the US. Despite this, 50% of the workers in Japan were still involved in primary industries such as farming, fishing, and mining. In 27, people who worked in urban areas earned a little bit more than families who came from farming communities. So when comparing these incomes, family income among farming communities was just 70% of that of city workers, office workers, right? 84% of Japan's population was rural and urban workers, but only accounted for 50% of Japanese household income. All of these statistics show that there was a great income inequality in Japan, and most of the wealth was going to the rich business owners in Japan, right? The wealthy business, such as shipbuilding, mining, banking, textiles, all of these, they had close ties with the government. They were influencing the government heavily and the parties and basically saying what goes. So really, again, this proves again that there's not a democracy occurring in Japan. It is a democracy for the rich, right? And we know what that is, right? Government leaders did nothing to curb the monopoly or wealth inequality in Japan. In fact, as quoted by Hain, historian, in fact, they were integral to the goal of building a rich nation and a powerful military. A military and a political expansion abroad went hand in hand with the Zabatsu control of markets and resources. So the government was like, hey, we're totally down to do this. We're not ignorant that this is happening. They were very well aware. This is the last one. Economic challenges, industry and agriculture. Again, in 1927, Japan faced a banking crisis, which showed that Japan was becoming more monopolistic, which means that all these big banks that were already powerful were buying out all these little banks, or the little banks were going out of business because they couldn't compete with the big banks, right? So now there's a monopoly of banks. People don't have options of where to go, which means that these banks can do whatever they want, charge any interest that they want, and kind of practice any shady and really crappy business models and policies that they can implement for their customers, right? Because people in Japan don't have options anymore, right? Well, most of the country's finances were controlled by a few banks. This made the rich grow wealthier and in size and in power, which is what they wanted. And so we can see how this is all going to set up later on down the line. And that is it. Thank you.